My thesis is that because of the Apple versus Microsoft conflict in the 1980s and 1990s, graphical user interface became accessible to all computer companies and therefore became a standard in technology. Hello everyone. Welcome newscasters. I'm Bill Gates, and today I am here because of the recent passing of my friend, Steve Hall Jobs. As you are aware, Steve unfortunately passed away yesterday after his long struggle with pancreatic cancer. People are asking me on my thoughts on Steve's passing and their past relationship. I believe Steve played an important role in the development of technology. Steve was a genius. He was a visionary. An innovator. He used his intelligence to build the personal computer, iPhone, iPad, and iPod. Prior to the Apple versus Microsoft conflict, Steve and I had a friendly relationship. We had rekindled that friendly relationship once more over the past few years and even made our friendship stronger. You may have heard about the conflict of Apple versus Microsoft. The conflict may have also been called hardware versus software. Apple had the hardware, and Microsoft had the software. The core of our conflict was graphical user interface, known as GUI. Graphical user interface was an operating for computers that allowed the users to interact with their computer and uses the mouse. GUI allows users to point and click on icons to access programs. It is the visual displays that you see on the home pages of computers. GUI made computers easy to use for everyone and not just those with a technology background. The heart of our conflict was who owned the rights to GUI. Did Apple own the rights to GUI? Did Xerox own the rights to GUI? Or did Microsoft own the rights to GUI? To understand the conflict, you must understand Apple in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. In 1976, Steve Jobs developed the Apple I in his garage with his friend, Steve Wozniak. Next, Steve Jobs developed the Apple II. Extremely successful. A 4 kilobyte of RAM, a 1 MHz processor, and cassette drives were included in this Apple II package. Many people preferred choosing their own devices and applications in the Apple II. Back in April of 1977, the computer was considered Apple's bread and butter product. The Apple II did have competition. IBM had developed their own PC that gave stiff competition to the Apple II. The Lisa was the first time in 1983 when Apple introduced graphical user interface into its computers, and the first time that Apple introduced the mouse into its computers. Now, the Apple Lisa sold for $10,000. Would you really buy that for $10,000? Exactly. The Macintosh, in 1984, used and enhanced graphical user interface. This was the first computer that was mass-produced with graphical user interface. Now, let me explain the relationship between Apple and Microsoft. I started Microsoft in 1975 as a company that created and sold computer software. Steve Jobs asked me to write programming for the Apple II in 1977. I sold to Apple BASIC, which is a programming language, for their Apple II. Later, again in January 1984, Apple asked me to develop an application for the Macintosh. I sold to them Microsoft Multiplan. Then, Apple asked me to develop software for the Macintosh which they were building. I will admit, though, I may have skipped over a few bugs in the Word application. To get it out quicker, the Wall Street Journal stated that I used high-pressure tactics to extract a virtual blank check to borrow many Macintosh ideas from Microsoft's own products. What do they mean? I even added Word, Excel, and multiplayer. Starting in January 1985, the Macintosh. While Apple was creating their Macintosh, I decided to create Windows 1. Windows 1 is an operating system for computers. Windows 1 included a notepad, calculator, calendar, clock, file manager, control panel, a game over website, Windows Write, Pin-On, and graphical user interface to top it all off. Computers with Windows 1 were now the #1 competitor to the Macintosh on the computer market. Tension began to rise between Apple and Microsoft when Apple thought that I had stolen certain elements of the Macintosh operating system for Word. Steve felt betrayed and was furious. He accused me of ripping off the Macintosh and graphical user interface. I really knew that graphical user interface came from a company named Xerox. Well, Steve, I think there's more than one way of looking at it. I think it's more like we both had this rich neighbor named Xerox, and I broke into his house to steal the TV set to find out that you had already stolen it. And I responded to his accusation. This was when the war started. They just ripped us off completely because Gates has no shame, was what Steve said. I felt infuriated by Steve's comments, considering the work that I put into the Macintosh, his computer. If he believes that, he really has entered into one of his own reality distortion fields. I fired back. I began to think. Apple needed Microsoft, but Microsoft did not need Apple. Why? Apple needed Microsoft's Windows, Word, Excel, and multiplayer. But Microsoft was already selling Windows to other bigger computer producers on the market, such as IBM. Since we are two such close working companies, we reached an agreement. Apple made a license allowing us to use certain elements of the Macintosh in 1985. Windows 1 was being criticized, and many people claimed that certain things were missing. So, 2 years later, in 1987, I created Windows 2 to address some of this criticism. Apple claimed that the license they had given us for the Macintosh was only for Windows 1, and that Windows 2 did not come with this license. In 1988, Apple Computer Incorporated filed a copyright infringement lawsuit against Microsoft. This case was referred to as Look and Feel because it was about the visual displays of the Macintosh, known as GUI. Graphical User Interface gives users a look to the computer and a feel for navigating around the computer. Apple claimed that I had stolen 189 design elements of the Macintosh illegally. In 1995, we won the case when the Supreme Court claimed that they did not want to hear the case and that the Ninth Circuit Court's ruling upheld the license that Apple had given us in 1985. In 1997, Apple was going under. I invested $150 million into the company to keep them afloat. I appeared on a conference with Steve in 1997. When I appeared on screen, many angry and disappointed Apple fans booed. Steve said, "If we want to move on and see Apple healthy and prospering again, we have to let go of this notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose." This was when Steve and I held a compromise and ended the Apple versus Microsoft conflict in 1997. Sadly, Steve is gone now. I wish I could have spent more time with him. I'm sad because of that fact, but happy knowing that he made his mark on the world in his own special way in the technology field. Steve's last words were treasure love for your families, for your spouse, for your friends. Treat yourselves well. Cherish others. Thank you all for attending this conference today. I appreciate it greatly, and may Steve rest in peace.